The oxygen mask dangled uselessly as Captain Marcus Hendricks slumped forward against the F-16's control stick, his breathing shallow and erratic at 35,000 feet. The fighter jet began a gentle but deadly spiral toward the Afghan mountains below, its engines humming their mechanical death song. In the back seat, what the squadron had dismissed as dead weight for 7 years suddenly came alive. Lieutenant Colonel Zara, Phantom, Novik hadn't touched flight controls since the incident that supposedly ended her career. The woman they whispered about in ready rooms across 3 continents, the pilot who'd vanished into a classified black hole and emerged broken, grounded forever, now faced a choice that would either vindicate everything she'd lost or confirm every doubt they'd harbored about her shattered mind. "Viper lead, this is Viper 2, she transmitted, her voice steady despite the chaos. "We have a medical emergency. Captain Hendricks is unconscious. I'm taking control." The radio crackled with disbelief. "Negative, Viper 2. You are not qualified for." "Tower, this is Phantom." The call sign she hadn't used in 7 years cut through their protests like a blade through silk. "I have aircraft control." Below them, the Panjshir Valley stretched like a brown scar across the landscape. The altimeter unwound rapidly. 30,000 feet, 28,000, 25,000. Standard emergency procedures demanded she maintain heading and altitude while attempting to revive her pilot, but Zara Novik had learned long ago that standard procedures were written by people who'd never faced impossible choices in impossible places. She pulled back on the stick, feeling the familiar resistance of an F-16 fighting against gravity and physics. The aircraft responded like an old lover recognizing a forgotten touch. Her hands, scarred from burns that had taken months to heal, moved across the instrument panel with muscle memory that 7 years of exile couldn't erase. "Control, I need immediate vector to Bagram. Have medical standing by." "Phantom, confirm your current status and qualifications." The question hung in the thin air like an accusation. Status: officially grounded. Qualifications: revoked after the Damascus incident that had killed her wingman and nearly destroyed her sanity. But 30,000 feet above hostile territory, with an unconscious pilot and fuel gauges trending toward empty, qualifications mattered less than the simple fact that she was the only person aboard who remembered how to fly. "Control, Phantom is mission ready," she lied, knowing that sometimes the greatest truths lived inside the smallest lies. The mountains below seemed to reach up toward them with rocky fingers, hungry for another American aircraft to add to their collection. 7 years ago, they'd buried her career in a classified file marked psychological unfitness for duty. Today, she would either bury that judgment forever or die trying. The radio crackled again, but this time the voice carried a different tone. "Phantom, we copy. Bagram has been notified. Bring our boys home." Zara smiled grimly and pushed the throttle forward. Home was still 300 miles and a lifetime away. The first time anyone had seen Zara Novik cry was during her court-martial, not from shame, but from rage at being judged by men who'd never lost a wingman to their own mistake. The second time would be 17 years later, standing over her son's grave in Arlington, wearing stars on her collar that she'd earned through blood, skill, and the kind of stubborn refusal to quit that had once been called insubordination. But that was still years in the future. Right now, at 29 years old and flying an aircraft she technically wasn't qualified to touch, Zara focused on the immediate problem: keeping Captain Hendricks alive while navigating through some of the most dangerous airspace in the world. "Phantom, this is Bagram Tower. We have your emergency declared. State your fuel status and souls on board." "Bagram, Phantom shows 8,000 pounds remaining, 2 souls on board. Pilot is unconscious, possible cardiac event. Request priority handling and medical response." The professional calm in her voice masked the growing dread in her chest. 8,000 pounds sounded like a lot, until you considered they were still 200 miles from base, flying a jet that burned fuel like a drunk sailor burned through shore leave money. Basic math suggested they had maybe 20 minutes of flight time remaining if everything went perfectly. In Zara's experience, nothing ever went perfectly. She checked her GPS coordinates against the paper chart strapped to her kneeboard, a habit from her early days when pilots still practiced celestial navigation and trusted their instruments only as far as they could verify them. The mountains of the Hindu Kush stretched endlessly in every direction, their peaks reaching toward 10,000 feet and their valleys hiding secrets that had swallowed armies for centuries. Viper 2, Viper lead. The radio transmission made her blood freeze. Viper lead was supposed to be Captain Jennifer "Shark" Morrison, flying wing position in the formation they'd abandoned when Hendricks collapsed. But Morrison's voice carried an edge that meant trouble. Viper lead, go ahead. Phantom, we've got company. 2 aircraft bearing 090 low and fast. They're not supposed to be here. Zara's eyes flicked to the radar display, but at their altitude and with her focus on flying, she'd missed the approaching signatures. Now they showed clearly, 2 contacts moving at high speed toward their position. In this airspace, unidentified aircraft usually meant one thing. Shark, can you identify? Working on it, they're maintaining radio silence. Phantom, you need to know, these aren't showing up on our mission brief. The implication hit like a physical blow. Friendly aircraft would have identification codes and radio contact with coalition forces. The fact that Morrison couldn't identify them suggested they were dealing with something much more dangerous than a medical emergency. Zara keyed her radio to the emergency frequency, gambling that whoever was flying those mystery aircraft might be monitoring standard channels. Unknown aircraft. This is United States Air Force emergency flight. We have medical emergency on board. Request you maintain distance and identify yourselves. Silence. She tried again in Dari, then Pashto, exhausting her limited vocabulary of phrases that might convince hostile pilots that she posed no threat. Still nothing. The radar signatures grew closer, now less than 50 miles out and closing fast. At their combined speeds, they had maybe 3 minutes before visual contact. Shark, I need you to make a judgment call. Copy, Phantom. I'm moving to intercept. You focus on getting Captain Hendricks home. Through the canopy, Zara could see Morrison's F-16 banking hard right, moving to place herself between the emergency flight and whatever was coming their way. It was exactly the kind of selfless courage that made fighter pilots legendary and widows out of their wives. Captain Hendricks stirred slightly in the front seat, mumbling something incoherent. His vital signs on the display showed heart rate and blood pressure that suggested he was stabilizing, but he remained unconscious and unable to control the aircraft. 7 years of exile hadn't dulled Zara's tactical instincts. The unknown aircraft were approaching from the east, which put them between her emergency flight and the direct route to Bagram. Her fuel situation meant she couldn't afford to take a longer route around the threat, but flying directly toward potentially hostile aircraft with an unconscious pilot violated every rule of engagement she'd ever learned. Unless the rules didn't matter anymore. Bagram Tower, Phantom. Be advised, we have unknown aircraft in our vicinity. Request immediate fighter escort if available. Phantom Bagram. Negative on immediate escort. Nearest combat air patrol is 40 minutes out. You are cleared direct Bagram. Maintain current heading and altitude. 40 minutes might as well have been 40 years. Whatever was going to happen would be decided long before help arrived. The mountains below looked different from 30,000 feet than they had from the back of a transport helicopter during her last deployment. From this height, they seemed almost peaceful, their dangerous beauty unmarked by the violence that played out daily in their shadows. Zara had learned to love and hate these mountains in equal measure, love for their ancient indifference to human ambition, hate for the way they hid enemies and turned weather into a weapon. Phantom Shark, I have visual on the unknowns. Morrison's voice carried a tension that made Zara's hands tighten on the controls. In the fighter-pilot community, tension meant targets, and targets meant decisions that would be analyzed and second-guessed for years to come. Shark identify. Phantom, these are MiG-29s. They're not on any friendly list I've got. The blood in Zara's veins turned to ice water. MiG-29 Fulcrums were Russian-built air superiority fighters, fast and deadly in the right hands. More importantly, they weren't supposed to exist in Afghan airspace, where the coalition maintained strict control over military aviation. Shark, are you certain? Affirmative. Twin-engine, twin-tail configuration, distinctive intake design. These are definitely Fulcrums, and they're definitely not friendly. Zara's mind raced through the tactical situation. 2 enemy fighters against 1 combat-ready F-16 and 1 emergency aircraft with an unconscious pilot. The math wasn't encouraging, even without considering that she technically wasn't supposed to be flying at all. Bagram Tower, this is Phantom declaring hostile aircraft in vicinity. Request immediate support and clearance to deviate from flight plan if necessary. Phantom, Bagram copies hostile aircraft. You are cleared to maneuver as necessary for safety of flight. Be advised, political clearance for engagement is being sought at higher levels. Political clearance meant lawyers and generals having conversations in air-conditioned offices, while she and Morrison faced live ammunition at altitude. It was exactly the kind of bureaucratic paralysis that had contributed to her original downfall 7 years ago. Shark, what's your fuel state? Phantom, I'm showing 12,000 pounds. Good for about 30 minutes of combat maneuvering. Better than Zara's situation, but not by much. In air-to-air combat, fuel was life, and neither of them had enough life remaining for a prolonged engagement. The radar display showed the MiGs continuing their approach, now less than 30 miles out. At current speeds, they would be within visual range in less than 2 minutes. Whatever was going to happen would happen soon. In the front seat, Captain Hendricks stirred again, this time with more purposeful movement. His head turned slightly, and she could see him trying to focus on the instruments. Recovery was possible, but he was still at least several minutes away from being able to resume control of the aircraft. Several minutes they might not have. Shark, Phantom, I need you to know something. Morrison's voice came back immediately. Go ahead. If this goes bad, tell them I was flying legal. Tell them Phantom came back. There was a long pause before Morrison replied. Phantom, nothing's going bad today. We're all going home. But through her headset, Zara could hear the sound that every fighter pilot dreaded. The distinctive radar-locked tone that meant someone had just painted her aircraft with targeting radar. The MiGs had found them, and they were preparing to shoot. The rules of engagement were clear. Coalition aircraft were not to fire unless fired upon, and even then, only after confirming hostile intent through a complex series of protocols, designed more for lawyers than combat pilots. But at 30,000 feet above Afghanistan, with an unconscious pilot and fuel running low, the rules of engagement seemed like suggestions written by people who'd never faced impossible choices in impossible places. Phantom, I'm spiked. Morrison's transmission confirmed what Zara's own radar warning receiver was screaming in her headset. They were being targeted by enemy fire control systems. The MiGs weren't just observing, they were preparing to engage. Bagram Tower, this is Phantom. We are being illuminated by hostile fire control radar. Request immediate clearance to engage. Phantom, stand by for engagement authority. Stand by. The 2 words that had probably gotten more American pilots killed than enemy action. Stand by while lawyers argued. Stand by while politicians calculated. Stand by while enemy missiles closed the distance at 3 times the speed of sound. Shark, I'm going defensive. Zara pulled the F-16 into a sharp left turn, using the aircraft's superior maneuverability to break the radar lock while simultaneously descending toward the relative safety of lower altitude. The maneuver was instinctive, muscle memory from thousands of hours of training that 7 years of exile couldn't erase. In the front seat, the violent maneuvering caused Captain Hendricks to slump forward again, undoing whatever progress he'd made toward consciousness. But an unconscious pilot was better than a dead pilot, and at the moment, staying alive took priority over medical emergencies. Phantom, Shark, the MiGs are splitting up. One's coming after you, the other's positioning for a head-on intercept. Classic Soviet tactics: divide the enemy's attention, force them to fight on multiple fronts, exploit their weaknesses through superior numbers. Zara had studied these maneuvers at the Air Force Academy, practiced against them in countless training scenarios, but she'd never faced them with a sick wingman and an aircraft she technically wasn't qualified to fly. The radar warning receiver continued its urgent warnings, indicating that she was still being tracked by enemy systems. But the tone had changed subtly, suggesting that the MiGs were cycling through different radar modes, possibly preparing to launch missiles. Bagram Tower, Phantom. I need engagement authority now. Phantom, we are still waiting for. The transmission cut off as her radar warning receiver suddenly screamed with the distinctive sound of an active missile launch. Someone had just fired a radar-guided missile, probably an R-77 or similar Russian weapon, and it was tracking toward her position at better than Mach 3. Training took over. Zara pulled the aircraft into a brutal climbing turn while simultaneously deploying chaff and flares, trying to break the missile's lock through a combination of maneuvering and electronic countermeasures. The G-forces pressed her back into her seat with crushing weight, making every breath an effort. Phantom, missile in the air. Morrison's warning was unnecessary. Zara could see the smoke trail climbing toward her position like a deadly finger pointed at her heart. The missile was closing fast, its seeker head probably already locked onto her aircraft's radar signature. She reversed her turn, diving toward the mountains while continuing to deploy countermeasures. The missile followed, its guidance system trying to predict her flight path and intercept her aircraft at some calculated point in space and time. At 20,000 feet, with the mountains reaching up toward her like brown teeth, Zara made a decision that would have been called reckless by any reasonable standard. She pointed the F-16's nose directly at the nearest peak and pushed the throttle to full military power. The mountains of Afghanistan had claimed hundreds of aircraft over the decades, but they had also hidden countless pilots from enemy sensors. Radar worked by line of sight, and if she could get the mountains between herself and the missile, she might have a chance. The missile exploded somewhere behind and above her, its proximity fuse triggered by chaff or possibly confused by the ground return from the mountains. The shock wave rattled the aircraft, but they were still flying. Phantom, you're clear of the first missile. But Morrison's voice carried a warning that made Zara's blood run cold. Be advised, there's a second MiG positioning for another shot. I'm engaging. Through her headset, Zara could hear the sounds of Morrison's air-to-air engagement. The whine of radar, the clatter of cannon fire, the urgent warnings of flight systems pushed to their limits. Fighter combat was chaotic and violent and usually over in seconds, but those seconds felt like hours when someone you cared about was fighting for their life. Shark, what's your status? Engaged with Bandit 1. Bandit 2 is maneuvering for another shot at you. Recommend you continue evasive action. The fuel gauges showed numbers that made Zara's heart sink. Less than 4,000 pounds remaining. At their current consumption rate, they had maybe 10 minutes of flight time before the engines flamed out, and they became expensive gliders. Bagram was still over 100 miles away, and every defensive maneuver took them further from safety. In the front seat, Captain Hendricks was stirring again, his head moving with more purpose. His right hand reached weakly toward the control stick, suggesting that his motor functions were beginning to return. Recovery was still possible, but it would take time they didn't have. Phantom, Bandit 2 is positioning for another shot. You need to go defensive again. Zara looked at her fuel gauges, then at the unconscious pilot in front of her, then at the mountains that stretched endlessly toward the horizon. Mathematics suggested they couldn't survive another engagement cycle. Physics suggested they couldn't reach Bagram without more fuel than they possessed. Logic suggested they were about to become statistics in someone's after-action report. But Zara Novik hadn't survived 7 years of exile by accepting what mathematics, physics, and logic suggested was impossible. She'd survived by finding third options when everyone else saw only 2 choices. Shark, I'm going to do something stupid. Phantom, negative. Stick to standard defensive procedures. Shark, standard procedures assume we have fuel and time. We've got neither. Before Morrison could respond, Zara pulled the F-16 into a climb that violated every principle of energy management she'd ever learned. Instead of hugging the terrain and trying to avoid detection, she pointed the aircraft's nose toward the sky and climbed directly toward the approaching MiG. The maneuver was called a vertical reversal, and it was exactly the kind of aggressive tactic that could either save her life or get her killed very quickly. By climbing toward the enemy instead of running away, she was gambling that the MiG pilot would be surprised enough to make a mistake. At 25,000 feet, climbing through 30,000, she could see the MiG-29 clearly through her heads-up display. The Russian-built fighter was sleek and deadly, its twin engines leaving contrails in the thin air as it maneuvered for a missile shot. But the pilot had made a mistake. He'd assumed she would continue running, and his intercept geometry was calculated for a fleeing target, not one climbing directly toward him. As a result, he was out of position for an immediate shot and would have to maneuver to reacquire her. Phantom, what the hell are you doing? Morrison's voice carried a mixture of admiration and terror that perfectly captured Zara's own feelings about her current tactical situation. What she was doing was probably insane, definitely dangerous, and potentially effective. The MiG pilot realized his mistake and pulled his aircraft into a hard left turn, trying to bring his weapons to bear on Zara's climbing F-16. But the turn cost him energy, and energy in air combat was more precious than ammunition. At 35,000 feet, Zara reversed her climb and dove toward the MiG's flight path, using gravity to accelerate her aircraft beyond its normal performance limits. The maneuver put tremendous stress on both the airframe and her body, but it also positioned her for something the MiG pilot wouldn't expect: a head-on attack run. Phantom, you're going Winchester to Winchester with a fulcrum. That's suicide. Morrison was right. Head-on attacks between modern fighters usually ended with both aircraft destroyed, which was why most pilots avoided them. But Zara wasn't most pilots, and this wasn't a normal engagement. The distance closed rapidly: 5 miles, 4 miles, 3 miles. At 2 miles, both aircraft would be within cannon range, and someone would have to make a decision about who was willing to press the attack closer to the merge. At 1 mile, Zara could see the MiG's pilot through his canopy, a dark figure behind reflective glass. For just a moment, she wondered what he was thinking, whether he had family waiting for him somewhere, whether he understood that they were both about to risk everything for reasons that politicians and generals would argue about long after they were dead. Then training took over, and personal considerations became irrelevant. The MiG pilot flinched first. At 3/4 of a mile, he pulled his aircraft into a hard right turn, trying to avoid the collision course while positioning for a follow-up attack. It was a reasonable decision, tactically sound, and exactly what Zara had been counting on. Instead of following the MiG into the turn, she maintained her heading and used the brief separation to extend away from the engagement area. It wasn't a victory. The MiG could easily catch up once his pilot realized what she'd done, but it bought her precious seconds and distance. Phantom, nice moves, but you've got a problem. Morrison's voice carried a new urgency that made Zara check her instruments. The fuel gauges showed less than 2,000 pounds remaining, and they were still over 70 miles from Bagram. The mathematics were becoming inescapable. They weren't going to make it. Shark, what's your status with Bandit 1? Engaged, but he's good. This guy knows what he's doing. Which meant Morrison couldn't disengage to help, leaving Zara alone with her pursuing MiG and a fuel situation that was rapidly becoming critical. In the front seat, Captain Hendricks was finally showing signs of coherent consciousness. His head turned toward the instrument panel, and his hands moved with more purpose toward the controls. Recovery was imminent, but timing was everything. "Captain, can you hear me?" Hendricks's voice came through the intercom, weak but understandable. "Where? What happened?" "Sir, you lost consciousness. We're in a tactical situation. I need you to stay calm and let me handle the aircraft for now." The admission that she was handling the aircraft hung in the air between them like a confession of guilt. Officially, she wasn't qualified to fly. Officially, she shouldn't have been in the cockpit at all. But officially didn't matter at 30,000 feet with enemy fighters and diminishing fuel. "Phantom, Phantom, is that you?" Even in his weakened state, Hendricks recognized her call sign. The legend of Phantom had spread through the fighter community like wildfire, whispered in ready rooms and debated in classified briefings. Some said she was the best pilot of her generation. Others said she was dangerous, unstable, a liability who'd cracked under pressure. Today, she was their only hope of getting home alive. "Yes, sir, Phantom has aircraft control. We're approximately 70 miles from Bagram, low fuel, with hostile aircraft in the vicinity. I need you to monitor the radios while I concentrate on flying." Hendricks's response surprised her. "Phantom, I've heard the stories. Get us home." The simple statement carried more weight than any official qualification or endorsement she'd ever received. Here, in the cockpit of a fighter aircraft above enemy territory, with fuel running low and hostile aircraft closing in, Marcus Hendricks had just given her something she hadn't possessed in 7 years. Trust. "Sir, I'll get us home." Behind them, the pursuing MiG was closing distance again, its pilot having realized that the head-on attack had been a feint rather than a genuine assault. The radar warning receiver showed intermittent contacts, suggesting the enemy pilot was cycling his radar to avoid being tracked while maintaining contact with his target. "Phantom, Shark, I'm Winchester on missiles, switching to guns." Morrison's transmission meant she'd expended all her air-to-air missiles against the first MiG, and was now limited to her internal cannon. In modern air combat, cannon engagements were dangerous and personal, requiring pilots to close within visual range and rely on marksmanship rather than sophisticated guidance systems. "Shark, what's your fuel state?" "Phantom, I'm showing 800 pounds. I'm not making it back to Bagram." The admission hit Zara like a physical blow. Morrison had been fighting the first MiG while Zara dealt with the second, and the engagement had consumed most of her remaining fuel. In a few minutes, she would be forced to eject over hostile territory, leaving Zara alone with her unconscious pilot and pursuing enemy. Unless there was another option. "Shark, there's a forward operating base about 30 miles north of your position. Call sign Outpost Phoenix. They've got a short runway, but they can take an F-16 in emergency conditions." "Phantom, that's not on my chart." "It's classified. Special operations use it for insertion and extraction. Tell them Phantom sent you and that you're declaring an emergency." The brief conversation had cost precious time and fuel. The MiG behind them was now less than 10 miles out, close enough for a missile shot if his pilot decided to engage. But something was wrong with the tactical picture. The enemy aircraft wasn't maneuvering for an attack. Instead, it seemed to be maintaining position, following but not closing for the kill. "Captain, are you seeing anything unusual on the radar display?" Hendricks, now more alert, studied the instruments with the focused attention of an experienced pilot. The trailing MiG isn't acting like he wants to engage. He's maintaining distance, almost like he's hurting us. The realization sent chills through Zara's body. The two MiGs hadn't been trying to shoot them down. They'd been trying to force them away from Bagram and toward some predetermined location. But why? And toward what? "Phantom Shark, I'm breaking off toward Outpost Phoenix. Thanks for the heads up." "Shark, good luck. Give my regards to the Special Operations community." Morrison's F-16 banked away toward the north, leaving a fatting contrail in the clear morning air. Now it was just Zara, Captain Hendricks, and the mysterious MiG that seemed more interested in following than fighting. The fuel gauges showed numbers that made rational thought difficult. Less than 1,000 pounds remaining. At current consumption, they had maybe 5 minutes of flight time before the engines flamed out and they became gliders. Bagram was still 50 miles away, mathematically impossible to reach with their remaining fuel. But impossible had never stopped Zaranovic before. "Captain, I need you to handle communications while I work on our fuel problem." "Phantom, what fuel problem?" Instead of answering, Zara pulled the throttles back to idle and pushed the nose down into a shallow dive. The maneuver was called a gliding descent, and it could stretch their remaining fuel by trading altitude for distance. It was also extremely dangerous at low altitudes above mountainous terrain, but dangerous was better than impossible. "Bagram Tower, this is Phantom declaring fuel emergency. Request immediate priority handling and emergency equipment standing by." Hendricks's voice was stronger now, carrying the professional calm that marked experienced military aviators. Whatever had caused his collapse, he was recovering rapidly. "Phantom, Bagram Tower, we copy fuel emergency. You are cleared direct Bagram, descend and maintain flight level 200. Emergency equipment is standing by." 20,000 feet would put them just above the highest peaks in their flight path, close enough to the mountains to make navigation critical. But it would also allow them to glide further on their remaining fuel, potentially stretching their endurance long enough to reach the base. "Phantom, you're insane." The voice came through the radio, but it wasn't Hendricks or the control tower. It was the MiG pilot, speaking in accented but clear English. "Unknown aircraft, identify yourself." "My call sign is Wolf. I have been following your flight for the last 30 minutes. The admission confirmed Zara's suspicions about being herded, but it raised more questions than it answered. Why was the enemy pilot communicating with them? And why in English? "Wolf, state your intentions." "Phantom, my intentions are to ensure you reach your base safely." The statement was so unexpected that Zara almost forgot to maintain aircraft control. Enemy fighters didn't escort coalition aircraft to safety. Enemy fighters shot down coalition aircraft and claimed victories for their intelligence services. "Wolf, explain." "Phantom, you do not recognize my voice, but I recognize yours. 7 years ago, you saved my life over Syria. Today, I return the favor." The memory hit like lightning. A night mission over Damascus, surface-to-air missiles filling the sky like deadly fireworks, and a voice on the emergency frequency calling for help in broken English. She'd been leading a 2-ship formation of F-16s when they'd encountered a damaged MiG-29 trying to reach friendly territory. Instead of engaging, she'd escorted the enemy aircraft to the border, even providing navigational assistance when its GPS system failed. It had been a violation of rules of engagement, a career-ending decision that had contributed to her eventual downfall. But it had also saved the life of a pilot who was somebody's son, somebody's hope, somebody's future. "Wolf, is that really you?" Phantom, after 7 years, you still fly like poetry. The compliment carried emotional weight that surprised her. In the sterile world of military aviation, poetry was rarely mentioned, but every pilot understood the difference between mechanical competence and artistic mastery. To be told you flew like poetry was to be told you had transcended technique and achieved something approaching grace. Wolf, why are you here? Phantom, my government does not know I am here. I heard radio traffic about an American emergency flight, and I recognized your voice. I could not let you die without repaying my debt. Behind them, a second MiG had appeared on radar, this one definitely hostile and maneuvering for an attack position. Wolf's aircraft immediately turned to intercept, positioning itself between the new threat and Zara's emergency flight. Phantom, continue to your base. I will handle my colleague. Through her headset, Zara could hear the sounds of an engagement between the two MiGs, rapid radio transmissions in a language she didn't understand, the whine of radar systems, the distinctive sound of cannon fire. Wolf was fighting his own countrymen to protect an American aircrew, risking everything to repay a 7-year-old debt of honor. At 15,000 feet, with Bagram finally visible through the haze, Captain Hendricks took control of the aircraft. His hands were steady on the stick, his voice confident on the radio, his recovery complete. But he didn't change course or altitude, trusting Zara's gliding descent to stretch their fuel to the maximum possible distance. Phantom, good work. I'll take it from here. Sir, thank you for trusting me. Phantom, after what I just saw, I'd trust you with anything. The simple statement carried more significance than any medal or commendation she'd ever received. Marcus Hendricks was a combat veteran, a pilot's pilot, someone whose opinion mattered in the tight-knit community of fighter aircraft commanders. His trust was worth more than official recognition. Bagram Tower, Phantom flight on final approach. Fuel state critical, estimate 30 seconds remaining. Phantom, Bagram Tower. You are cleared to land runway 27, emergency equipment standing by. Outstanding job, both of you. The landing was routine, professional, exactly the kind of controlled arrival that marked competent aircrew. But as they rolled out on the runway with engines flaming out from fuel starvation, Zara knew that nothing about this flight had been routine. Through the canopy, she could see emergency vehicles racing toward their aircraft, medical personnel preparing to treat Captain Hendricks, ground crews ready to tow the fuel-depleted F-16 to the maintenance hangar. It was the controlled chaos that marked a successful emergency response, proof that sometimes the system worked exactly as designed. But high overhead, too distant to see but close enough to matter, Wolf was still fighting his fellow pilot, still repaying a debt that honor demanded he settle. Whether he would survive his own homecoming was a question that would haunt Zara for years to come. As maintenance crews surrounded their aircraft and medical personnel helped Captain Hendricks from the cockpit, Zara remained in the back seat for a moment, processing everything that had happened. 7 years of exile had ended with 30 minutes of flight time that proved what she'd never stopped believing. She was still a pilot, still capable, still worthy of the wings she'd earned through blood and determination. Phantom. The voice belonged to Colonel Patricia Razor, Washington, the squadron commander who'd reluctantly agreed to let Zara fly as an observer on what was supposed to be a routine training mission. Washington was a legend in her own right, one of the first women to command a fighter squadron, someone whose opinion carried weight throughout the Air Force. Yes, ma'am. We need to talk. The tone suggested that Zara's unauthorized assumption of aircraft control would have consequences, probably negative ones. But as she climbed down from the cockpit and felt solid ground beneath her feet, she realized that consequences were something she could handle. For 7 years, she'd lived with the consequences of a single mistake. Today, she'd lived with the consequences of doing what needed to be done when no one else could do it. That evening, As the sun set behind the mountains that had nearly claimed their lives, Zara sat in the squadron ready room writing her after-action report. The document would become part of her official record, either vindication of her capabilities or confirmation of her recklessness, depending on who read it and what they chose to emphasize. But for the first time in 7 years, she wasn't afraid of what people might think. She'd proven something to herself that was more important than official recognition or career advancement. Phantom was back, and she was exactly who she'd always been. Outside, the mountain stood silent and eternal, indifferent to human ambition but witness to human courage. Somewhere among those peaks, Wolf was either flying home to an uncertain reception or lying in wreckage that would never be found. Either way, his debt was paid and hers was just beginning. The next morning brought consequences, as Colonel Washington had promised, but they weren't the consequences Zara had expected. "Phantom, you're being reassigned." The words hit like a punch to the solar plexus. Reassignment usually meant exile to some administrative position where her flying skills would atrophy and her career would die a slow, bureaucratic death. It was the kind of punishment that destroyed pilots more effectively than enemy action. "Ma'am, if I could explain." "No explanation necessary. Your unauthorized assumption of aircraft control was a clear violation of regulations. Your engagement with enemy aircraft without proper authorization was reckless. Your decision to trust an enemy pilot with classified information about American base locations was potentially treasonous." Each accusation was technically accurate and professionally devastating. Zara had indeed violated regulations, engaged enemy aircraft without authorization, and shared classified information with a foreign national. In a court-martial, any one of these charges could end her career permanently. "However," Washington continued, "your actions also saved the life of Captain Hendricks and potentially prevented the loss of a valuable aircraft.